The moment Jesus of Nazareth died, the world did not simply continue as before. Something shifted. Something unseen but deeply felt moved through the fabric of history. And here's the question few dare to ask. What if the crucifixion was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a hidden age the world was never meant to notice? Because what happened after his death did not just change religion. It changed power, it changed time, and it may have changed the heavens themselves. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is not taught in churches, rarely explored in history books, and almost never spoken of in one complete story. When Jesus breathed his last breath, the Gospels say the sky darkened, the earth shook, and the veil of the temple tore from top to bottom. These are not poetic details. In the ancient world, these signs meant one thing: cosmic authority had been challenged. Darkness at noon was not just unusual, it was terrifying. Earthquakes were believed to signal divine intervention. And the tearing of the veil was more than symbolism. It marked the collapse of a boundary that had stood for centuries, separating the divine from the human. Something that had been sealed was suddenly exposed. But what happened next is even more unsettling. Within hours of his death, the Roman world continued as if nothing had happened. Soldiers returned to their posts. Markets reopened. The empire still ruled. And yet, beneath the surface, the world had entered a new and dangerous phase. Because while Rome thought it had silenced a troublemaker, the early followers of Jesus believed something far more radical: that death itself had been broken. And this belief spread faster than any army. But before we talk about resurrection, we must talk about fear. Because the days immediately following the crucifixion were not filled with triumph, they were filled with terror. The disciples did not feel victorious. They felt hunted. They hid behind locked doors, whispering, waiting for soldiers to come for them next. They had followed a man they believed would change the world, and now he was gone, or so it seemed. But something strange began to happen. Reports started to spread, quiet at first. Then louder. Some said the tomb was empty. Others claimed they had seen him walking, speaking, eating. Not as a ghost. Not as a vision, but alive. And if that was true, then the execution of Jesus had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable, because Rome knew how to kill men. But it did not know how to deal with a movement that believed death no longer had authority. And this is where the world truly began to change. Within a few decades, the message of Jesus had spread from dusty villages to major cities of the empire, not through force, not through weapons, but through stories. Stories of forgiveness. Stories of resurrection. Stories that directly challenged the very foundation of Roman power, which was built on fear, domination, and control. But the next part will surprise you even more. Because the spread of Christianity did not just threaten Rome politically. It threatened something older. Something deeper, something tied to the ancient gods themselves. For centuries, the Roman world was filled with temples, rituals, and sacrifices. The gods were everywhere. Every city had its patron deity. Every army marched under divine favor. Every emperor was eventually declared divine. But as the message of Jesus spread, something strange began to happen. Temples emptied. Oracles fell silent. Ancient rituals lost their power. Early Christian writers believed this was not coincidence. They believed the death and resurrection of Jesus had triggered a spiritual collapse, a transfer of authority from the old powers to something new. And this idea was dangerous, because in the ancient worldview, gods were not metaphors. They were forces, powers, rulers of unseen realms. And if those powers were losing influence, it meant the world was undergoing a spiritual reordering. What comes next may change how you see the sky forever. Ancient people believed the heavens were alive with meaning. Stars were not just lights. They were signs. Movements in the sky were thought to reflect events on Earth. And after the death of Jesus, records from multiple cultures describe strange celestial events. Unusual eclipses, comets, unpredictable movements in the heavens. To modern eyes, these may seem like coincidence. But to the ancient mind, they were messages. Messages that something had shifted above. But the most shocking changes were not in the sky. They were in people. Former soldiers refused to kill. Slaves claimed spiritual equality with their masters. Women gathered as teachers and leaders. The poor were treated as heirs of a coming kingdom. None of this fit the Roman order. None of this could be controlled easily, and Rome responded the only way it knew how. Persecution. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed. Not because they were violent, but because they were uncontrollable. They refused to worship the emperor. They refused to bow to the gods. And worst of all, they believed their true king had already conquered death. But persecution only strengthened the movement, because every execution became a testimony. Every martyr became proof, in the minds of believers, that death had lost its grip. And this leads us to a question few ask. If Jesus truly defeated death, then where did that leave the powers that once ruled through fear of it? The next revelation uncovers a secret very few people know. Early Christian texts outside the Bible speak openly about spiritual conflict after the resurrection. They describe a world in turmoil, not just politically, but cosmically. According to these writings, the death of Jesus exposed the limitations of the unseen rulers of the world forces that had governed nations, inspired empires, and manipulated humanity for centuries. These texts suggest that the cross was not just an execution device. It was a trap. A moment where divine humility confronted cosmic pride. And when Jesus willingly entered death and emerged alive, the old powers lost their greatest weapon, fear. But the world after his death was not suddenly peaceful. In fact, it became more unstable. Wars continued. Empires rose and fell. Violence did not disappear. Instead, the struggle moved inward. The battlefield shifted from kingdoms to consciences. From armies to belief. People now had a choice. To live under the old system, power, dominance, survival at any cost, or to live as if a new reality had already begun. And that choice terrified those in control. As centuries passed, Christianity itself changed. It moved from hidden gatherings to official religion, from persecuted movement to imperial faith. And with that shift came compromise, politics, power, control. Some say the world lost something in that transition. Because the earliest believers did not think they were building a religion. They believed they were living in the aftermath of a cosmic event, a moment that fractured history itself. They believed the world was already ending, not in fire, not in destruction, but in transformation. And here is the part that still shocks scholars. Many early Christians believed the resurrection had begun a slow unraveling of the present age, that history itself was living on borrowed time, that the systems of the world were already condemned, even if they still appeared strong, which raises a haunting question. If that is true, then what kind of world have we been living in ever since? A redeemed one? Or a delayed one? The next part may change how you see everything that followed: empires, wars, science, even modern society itself. Because if the death of Jesus truly altered the structure of reality, then history after that moment is not just progress or decline, it is aftermath. A world trying to continue after something fundamental was broken, and that brings us to now. A modern world filled with technology, speed, and knowledge, yet haunted by the same fears. The same violence, the same hunger for control. Which forces a final question we are not ready to answer yet. Did the world truly change after the death of Jesus? Or are we still resisting the change that began that day? Because the story does not end here. In fact, this is only where the real mystery begins. And now, as we stand at the edge of everything we have uncovered, let us pause and look back at what this journey has revealed. We began with a death the world believed was an ending. A man hanging on a cross, abandoned, silenced, defeated. Yet we discovered that this moment was not the closing of a chapter, but the tearing open of reality itself. The sky darkened. The earth shook. Boundaries that had stood for centuries collapsed in a single breath. Power shifted. Fear was challenged. Death was confronted face to face. We followed the world after that moment, a world that continued outwardly as if nothing had changed, yet inwardly was never the same again. Empires marched on, temples still stood, rulers still claimed authority, but something invisible had been set in motion. A message spread without armies, a truth moved without weapons. Ordinary people began to live as if death no longer had the final word. We saw how fear lost its grip, how the old powers trembled, how hearts were awakened, how persecution failed to silence faith, how the cross became not a symbol of shame, but a declaration that love could endure suffering and still overcome the grave. We uncovered the unsettling truth that history after Jesus was not simply progress, it was aftermath. A world living in the shadow of a resurrection it could not undo. A reality still wrestling with a change that had already begun, and now that same question echoes toward us. If the death and resurrection of Jesus truly reshaped the world, what does that mean for you? This story is not ancient history alone. It is living truth. It is still moving, still calling, still transforming hearts today. So now, I ask you not as a viewer, but as a soul. If something in this message stirred you, do not keep it silent. Write your personal confession in the comments. Share a short prayer from your heart. Testify about what God has done in your life, whether He healed you, rescued you, restored you, or simply carried you through a season you thought you would not survive. Your words may be the very message someone else has been praying for. And I urge you with purpose and holy responsibility, share this video with at least 10 people or more. Not as content, not as entertainment, but as a living seed. Because when this message reaches more souls, it is not just a video being shared, it is God's word being carried forward, crossing screens, crossing borders, crossing hearts. Every share is a testimony. Every comment is a witness. Every view is a chance for transformation. Do not underestimate what God can do through obedience. If this message reached you, it was not by accident. And if you pass it on, you become part of the story, part of the movement that began not with power, but with sacrifice. Not with conquest, but with love. The world changed that day on the cross. And it is still changing now through you.